Hey there, Emmanuel here from Web Dev Fuel, and in today's video you're going to learn exactly how to authenticate an API using Phoenix. So basically you're going to learn how to use the Guardian framework to build an authentication system using Phoenix, which will allow people to log in and register an account, and basically you're going to do this using an API which will then talk to a client. So if this sounds good, let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, I first want to go over exactly why Phoenix is ideal for building an authentication system, and also why it is overall a great tool to be working when you want to build web applications. So the first thing that you want to keep in mind is the speed of Phoenix. So the thing is that it inherits the speed benefits of Elixir and Erlang. So because Elixir is very fast, we're also going to inherit all those benefits when using Phoenix, since Elixir is the language that is used for Phoenix. So Phoenix uses Elixir underneath it. Next thing is the productivity. So because Phoenix gives us a lot of utilities and a lot of command line tools for interacting with our application, we'll be able to basically become a lot more productive, since we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And finally, the reason that Phoenix is ideal for this project is because it is stable. So the thing is that Phoenix does not reinvent the wheel in the same way that a lot of other frameworks do. Rails basically does everything for you from the get-go. So it basically, if you want to go inside Rails and change something, you need to go in depth into the code and start to understand it. And because of this, a lot of people just use Ruby on Rails, and then they don't really understand what's going on. But Phoenix is a little bit different. Phoenix keeps things simple, but it gives you utilities, and it gives you APIs for interacting with a lot of different stuff, and you'll understand what I mean by that in just a minute. So that's basically the reason. It's fast, it's productive, and it's very stable. So with this in mind, let's get started with the prerequisites. So the first thing that you want to make sure you have is PostgreSQL. So for this, you want to write this and version. And if you have PostgreSQL installed and you write PSQL version, it will give you back the version of Postgres. And on some systems you actually need to do this, but on my system this will not work. The next thing that you want to make sure you have installed is, of course, Elixir. So if I go ahead and do Elixir -- version, it will give me back the Elixir version and the Erlang version that's installed. And with this in mind, obviously you also need to have Erlang installed. If you don't know really how to do this, you just go ahead and Google it. It's very easy. On Ubuntu, I think they have the dev packages. On macOS, I think Brew already has it included in the packages of Brew. So with that in mind, let's create the project. So the first thing that you want to do is run the mix phx.new command. And what this will do is basically spawn a new project. So you want to write this, and then you want to write, let's call this one auth tutorial Phoenix, and then you want to make sure that you include no webpack, and you also want to make sure that you include no HTML. So the reason we are doing this, so basically we are not including webpack and we are not including HTML, is because we are going to use this this project as an API instead of basically creating the entire MVC, so model view and controller, inside of Phoenix. We're going to connect then this to a REST client, or for example later after we test, you can connect it to a React, Vue project, wherever you prefer. So with this in mind, and also before I forget, you also do not need to include here the database Postgres, because it is done by default for you. So you could go ahead and do this and say, okay, so my database is Postgres, but because Phoenix already recommends Postgres, it is the default one, so we do not have to do this. Okay, so as you can see, the project is now created and we have a new folder in here called Auth Tutorial Phoenix. And also we have here some instructions, but we can skip over this for now. And first of all, we need to do something. So I'm going to start by sitting into the folder and then opening this inside VS Code. Okay, so now with VS Code opened, we need to do the first thing inside our project, which is to configure the database. So the first thing that you want to do is to look for this dev.exs file and change the credentials based on your account. So because I'm using Ubuntu inside Windows, I will need to set up the username, which in this case is going to be Emmanuel, and then the password, which I've set up for my local environment, which is my secret password. So if you're on production, usually you do not want to use this type of passwords, but because I'm on local on my local machine and no one has access to it, it's no problem. You can use something like this. So with this in mind, we can now go ahead, open our terminal and just run mix ecto.create. And what this will do is basically take these credentials and create a new database based on the name of our project. So first of all, let's just save this file and then we can go ahead and create our database. Okay, so the next step is to add our users and accounts context. So basically you want to add the users that you'll use to create them and then create the sessions and etc, etc. And you also want to add these users to what Phoenix calls a context. So basically a context, it's like a roof which a lot of different things in your application live under. So for example, in this case, the context is accounts because we're going to use this context to manage the account. So in this case, the user. And in the case that you want to do something different, for example, manage payments or manage a learning management system, you could basically create a different context to manage this and keep all your different parts of your application separate, which makes it very easy to not only write and be more productive, but also it makes it very stable and easy to change things in the future. So with this in mind, you first want to run this command. So you want to write mix phx.gen.json, and then you want to write this entire string right here. So basically what's happening here is we're calling phx.gen.json and we are not really interested in everything that this command is going to generate. And then the context is accounts, and then we're going to create the users, which basically is going to be the table name also. And then we define here all the columns inside the table. So basically we have first name, which is a string, last name, which is a string, email, which is a string and is unique, and finally the password, which we're going to hash a little bit later. And after running this command, as you can see, it just created a bunch of different files for us. So we're not really interested in all of these files and we're not really going to touch all of these files. But before we go ahead and do any of those things, we want to first of all just run mix ecto.migrate after we change all the fields to null. So here's what I mean by this. If you go in here and you look at this thing right here, you'll notice that basically it created for us all these fields, but after we run this migration command right here, it will not basically create this as not nullable, which we don't want. So you first of all need to write here null false and then copy all of these and paste them in here and save the file. So with this done, we can now go ahead and run mix ecto.migrate. Okay, so the next step is to clean up the user controller file and the accounts context file. So basically we're starting with the user controller, and then we want to come in here and delete all of this. So I'm going to select this, come down here, and as you can see, I've just deleted all of this. So again, do not worry about these errors because we're going to build the application step by step, and at the end, these will all go away. And the next thing that you want to change is also the account's context. So basically you want to come in here again and delete everything but the imports and the aliases. Okay, so we can now start building the application. So the first thing that you want to do is come into this file, which is mix.exs, and add here to our dependencies Bcrypt Elixir. So you want to write down Bcrypt Elixir, and then the version is going to be the following. So you want to add version also 2.0. So here's exactly what Bcrypt is. Bcrypt is basically a library. So it's basically, as it says here, a wrapper. So around the Bcrypt password hashing function. So what Bcrypt is basically a way for you to encrypt your passwords when storing them in the database. So basically you do not want to store passwords in plain text, and instead of that you want to make sure that they are encrypted, so if someone has access to the database they are not able to know exactly what that password is. So again, the first thing that you want to do is add this right here, and then after doing this you want to run mix.deps.get. So here VS Code already did that for me, but in case you are not on VS Code, you're on a different editor, I'm going to show you how to do this. So basically you want to run mix.deps.get. Okay, so with Bcrypt Elixir installed, we want to start adding everything that we need to create basically to create an account and to hash the password. So the first thing that you want to do is come to user.ex, which is basically the user schema file, and you want to copy this thing, paste it in here, and then call this registration changeset. So if you're familiar with Phoenix, you know what a changeset is. Basically you pass in here the schema and then you make a bunch of different changes. So for example here it casts all the attributes to these things, and then it also validates all the required fields, and then it makes sure that the unique constraint is there, which in this case is email. So here we also want to make sure all those things are done inside what we are going to call the registration changeset. And finally we're going to put the last thing in the registration to make sure it is different from here and that we have everything that we need to hash the password. So we're going to first of all create a private function called encrypt and put password. And we're going to pass the user, and then we're going to write the following. So with password. Okay, so basically what we have done here is say with the password field fetched, we want to do something in here. So we're going to do the following. Okay, so here's exactly what we've done inside of this function. So first of all, we're going to store inside the encrypted password variable. So we're going to basically use the bcrypt base hash password function, and we're going to pass the password that the user sends us, and also we're going to salt it with a 12 round, and we're going to pass through here for legacy. So if I do this again, as you can see in here, we're passing here the log rounds, and then it asks if you want to use the legacy, and we're going to pass true. Okay, and the next thing, I think I had it here. Yeah, exactly. And then the next thing that we want to do is we want to put the change. So what this is basically going to do is update this thing inside the database. So before we save this to the database, it updates the password of the user with the encrypted password. And finally, this is now here complaining because we are not using this function, and we want to use it inside of the registration changeset. And as you can see, this is the changeset that we need to encrypt and put the password. The next step is to add a create user function to the account's context. So first of all, go to account's context and then create a function called create user, in which we're going to pass the attributes that the user gives us, and then you want to create a struct which is a user, and pipe it into the user.registration changeset and pass the attributes. And also we want to, after processing all of these things using the changeset, we want to grab the repo and insert this data inside the repo. So with this, we have basically something that will create a user for us. And now we want to grab this function and insert it inside the controller. So you first of all want to come to the user controller and then again create a function called register, pass the connection, and then we want here a couple of things. First of all, we want to have a JSON object that's called user, which we're going to basically use to pass the user params. And then we're going to write the following. So with and then we're going to write the following. So with OK and user. So basically, if this all goes well, if everything inside this function goes well, we are going to basically continue inside of this. And then we're going to pass the connection, and you want to add put status of created, which is basically going to return a 201 code on the HTTP connection. And then we also want to add a text making to basically confirm with the user that the account was created. So we can pass a message like, and what this is going to do is basically return a message that says user successfully registered with email, and then we add here a space, and then we pass just the email to make sure that we do not deliver a lot of information after the registration, because it is not yet needed. And with the registration controller created, we can go into the router and add right here a post request that's going to create an user. We pass the user controller, and then we say that we are looking for the register function. So what's going to happen here is basically every time that someone requests, so first of all it's the local host and then the port and then /API/users, and then this is going to call inside the user controller the register function and basically create an user. And if you go inside our REST client and make a request, you will be able to see that basically this creates the user and returns the message that we were expecting. Now we need to add inside the accounts context all the functions that we need to make sure that we are able to authenticate an user. So the first thing that we want to do is add a function to get the user by email. And as you can see, inside the get by email function, we're basically going to pass the email, then query from the database a user where the email is the email that we passed, and finally we want to go to the repo and look for one which has this query. So basically we're going to pass the query to the repo, and if it doesn't go well, so basically if no email exists, it's going to return an error with a 404, so not found. And if all goes well, it returns the user. Next, we want to add a function that gets the user by ID. And as you can see, we're basically going to pass the ID and then look inside the repo for a user that has that exact ID. And finally, we want to create a function that authenticates the user. And as you can see, we're going to basically get the user by email, which is this function right over here. And then we want to validate the password, which is basically going to compare this password that someone who's trying to log in gives us. And then we're going to compare it to the user.password that we have stored inside our database. And to do this, we're going to create a private function called validate password, which is this one that we wrote down here. We're going to pass a password and an encrypted password. and then we want to use Bcrypt to verify the password, and again we're going to pass the one that the user gives us and then the encrypted one. And this is basically everything that we need in order to authenticate a user inside the account's context file. Now we want to add Guardian, which is basically a framework that will help us with authenticating the user. So here's exactly what Guardian is. This is basically, as it says here, a token authentication library for use with Elixir applications. And we're going to use this to basically make sure that every time someone makes a request, it's always authenticated and it goes through a pipeline, and it also delivers the right errors in case that an error arises. So with this in mind, just go again inside the mix.ehx file and basically copy this right over here and paste it in here. So just like before, we're going to add Guardian and then give the version number, which in this case is again 2.0. And we're going to now get the dependencies to make sure that they are fetched. So now that we have Guardian installed, we need to start configuring it. So basically, you first of all want to create inside this folder another folder called Authentication or Auth, whichever one you prefer. And then in here, we'll start by creating a file called error handler, which is basically the function that will handle all the errors. And then we'll call this one auth_tutorial_phoenix.guardian.auth error handler. And inside of here, we're going to add everything that we need to handle the error. So as you can see in here, we're basically going to import plug.conf and then add this behavior Guardian plug error handler and implement the Guardian plug error handler. So these are basically things that Guardian gives us that we need to add to this error handler file. So if you go inside the documentation, you'll see that they are saying that we need to add all of this. And then we're going to basically define a function called auth_error and then pass the connection, pass the type. We're going to hide the reason and the ops because we're not going to really need them. And then after that, we want to add inside this body variable basically a JSON that's encoded with a message that gives us the error back. And then with the connection, we can basically put the REST connection type as application JSON and then send the response as a 401, which is basically unauthorized. And with this, we're basically, we already have now an error handler. Now we want to create the auth pipeline. So this is basically something that we're going to use inside our router to make sure that it pipes through this entire thing and make sure that everything is set up in terms of authentication. So first of all, create here a file called pipeline.ex. And then inside of here, we want to do a couple of things. First of all, we want to define the claims. So for us, the claims are going to be of type access, which means that at each time that this goes through this pipeline, it has to be a token which is of type access. So we're going to basically create two different type of tokens, which is going to be the refresh token and the access token, which is going to basically create the entire authentication system. And because of this, on this auth pipeline, we do not want to have refresh tokens. That is going to be handled inside the router and not inside of here. And now we need to add inside the file here this that says basically that we are going to use the guardian.plug.pipeline inside this module. and then we add the OTP app as it has to be the same name as our application when you spawn the new application. In this case it's auth tutorial Phoenix. Then we want to add the module, which is in this case auth tutorial Phoenix.guardian, which we're going to create in just a second. And then you want to add the auth tutorial Phoenix.guardian.auth error handler as the error handler. And now we want to add 3 different plugs. So first of all, we want to add the plug that verifies the header with the following claims, which you've headered here, and then in the realm of bearer. Basically, this means that you have to pass to the header an authorization that has bearer and then a space and then the JSON token. Next, we want to make sure that it is authenticated, so basically that this is all authenticated. And finally, we want to make sure that the plug to load the resource is also in here, and we want to make sure that the resource exists. So what this is basically going to do is allow us to use the resource inside our controllers later. So for example, if you want to do something like user equals something something, and then you're going to use this user inside your controllers, and this ensures that the user is always present. And finally, we need to add the Guardian file. So you want to write here guardian.ex. Now we first of all create a module that's called auth tutorial Phoenix.guardian, which is the module that we added right here. And then we want to add the following inside of it. Okay, so here's exactly what we have inside the auth tutorial Phoenix.guardian module. First of all, we want to use the Guardian module, and the OTP again is the application name. Then we need to alias the accounts file, which is this module right over here. And finally, we need to add 2 different functions. First of all, subject for token, which basically gets our resource, basically our sub, which is the ID of the user, from the resource. So basically we want to grab from the user the ID and then turn this into the sub, which is going to be added to JSON Web Token. And the next function is the resource from claims, which basically does the reverse of all of this. It basically grabs the ID from the claims and then it returns the resource, which is in this case the user. So if you recall, we created here the getById function, and what this is going to do is basically return us the user from the function. Now the next step is to add Guardian to our configuration file. So you want to come inside config.ex, come here to the bottom, and then add the following config. Then we want to add the name of the application, and also add the following code. You want to make sure that you specify that the Guardian module is this one, which you've created right here, and then you want to make sure that you add the issuer, in this case the issuer of the JSON Web Token. Again, you can use whatever you want, but I'm going to use the application name. And finally, the secret key, which in production you do not want to have such a simple key, but in this case we can use something as simple as my secret key. Now we are almost finished. The next thing that you want to do is come inside the auth tutorial Phoenix web folder. So basically we have 2 different folders, this one and one which has web in it, and then come inside the views and create a new view that's called session view.ex. So the idea behind this is that we're first of all going to create an user, and then we're going to have a session, and these are 2 different things. We're going to manage the users inside basically we're going to create the user, register, edit the information, update the passwords, all of those things. And inside the session is where we handle everything that's needed for the session. So basically to create a JSON Web Token, to refresh the token, etc, etc. So with this in mind, let's create this module. And as you can see, we're going to add something very simple inside of this. Again, to create a view, we have to always add this right here. So as you can see, this is the view that we created automatically when we ran the command to create the users and all of those files that we did in the beginning. And that also created this right over here, which we're not going to use, but just an example. You need to first of all add this in here to make sure that this file is interpreted as a view. And then you want to basically add a function that renders this string right here. Every time that we pass this string, this is going to get all basically the access token and then return the access token. And the reason we're calling this access and not just token is to make sure that the people that are working with us, or if we're working alone, we need to make sure that we have the understanding that this is the access token and not just any token. Okay, so the next step is to add the session controller, and we want to add a session controller .ex and then define the module. And inside the module, we'll start by adding the following. Just like with view, we want to add use of tutorial Phoenix Web, which is the web module, and then use the controller. And we'll start by aliasing a couple of things. We first of all need the accounts, and then we also need to alias Guardian. So basically the accounts module and the Guardian module. And we also want to add this. In case you're not sure, again, if we come inside of here, the user module, you can see here that we have something called action fallback. And basically what this is going to do is basically if something inside of this controller fails and it matches something inside of this fallback controller, this is going to basically automatically give us back the error inside of just the application, instead of just the application failing. So again, this was created earlier when we created the users with the command, with the JSON command. So this is all done for us, but just to keep in mind why we are writing this right over here. And now we need to create 3 different functions: the new, the refresh, and the delete. The new function is going to create a new session. The refresh the session. So basically it's going to make sure that someone is already authenticated, and if it is, it refreshes the session. And the delete basically just goes ahead and deletes the cookies from the response, which then in the client we can handle that and basically make someone log out of our application. So we'll start now with the new function. And the first thing that we want to do is basically create a function for the controller, pass the connection, the email, and the password, which are going to be the values of the JSON that's sent from the client or from a REST client. And then we want to add here the following function, which is the function that we created in here that basically validates the password and makes sure that the email and the password matches an email and password inside that database. Now the first thing that we want to add in here, if all of this goes well, is the following thing. We basically want to encode and sign the token. So we're going to grab the user and then we're going to encode it with a token type of access and add a timeline, a lifetime of 15 minutes to this token. So the process is going to be the following. We have a token, that's the access token, that just has a life of 15 minutes, and then we have the refresh token, which can be, for example, 7 days. And then each time that someone sends us a request, we're going to use the refresh token to get the access token, and the access token gets the resources that we need. We are never going to use just one token to do the entire process, because that would be very, very unsafe in terms of security. So with this in mind, now we need to also create the refresh token. And as you can see, we did the exact same thing, but we basically just added here the token type of refresh, we added 7 days, and then we just called the variable something different to make sure it doesn't conflict. And finally, we're going to basically use the connection, put the resp cookie, which is basically we're going to add the cookie to the response with the following name, RUID, so no one knows really what this is, and we're going to pass the refresh token. This R means refresh, so you know inside your code what this really means. Then we need to put the status to a 1 of created, and finally render based on the view that we just created right over here, and basically we pass the exact same string, and then we pass the access token to make sure that it gives us back the JSON token inside the response. And finally, in case all of this goes wrong, we also need to account for that. So in case we get an error, we're basically going to encode the JSON here. So basically we're going to just add a simple message that says unauthorized, because we do not want to disclose a lot of information about what's happening inside the authentication process. And then we're going to send a response with a 401 and the following body. Okay, so with the new session function created, we need to add the refresh function. So as you can see, we basically pass again the connection, and we do not need the params since we're going to fetch it from the cookies. And with the following code, we're basically going to fetch the cookies from the connection, create a map from the struct, and then get the following item from the cookies. So as you can see, we're basically going to again use Guardian and use something that they give us called exchange. So what the exchange does is basically we're going to pass the refresh token inside the exchange, and then we're going to tell Guardian exactly what we want to exchange. So we want to exchange a refresh token for an access token. So this is very simple, and this is the reason why I really believe that Phoenix is very, very useful for programmers when developing applications. So instead of doing something like Rails and giving us everything, and then we really don't know what's happening inside our applications, or instead of building something from scratch and creating all of this logic ourselves, Phoenix gives us libraries that really help us with this kind of utility. So this is basically going to receive a refresh token, and then we say that we want to exchange the refresh for the access. And then here we get back the new access token, and then we basically return the connection, we just create a status, and then we render again the token.json. And in case something goes wrong in here, we're going to add the following. And just like with the new function, we want to basically, in case an error arises, we want to basically pass here the body, which is JSON.encode and an unauthorized message, and then return it with a 401 code. And finally, we need to add the delete function, which is basically going to help us log out our user, and this is not going to be used just by itself. You need to have some kind of strategy on your front end to make sure that you clear everything. So this is basically going to clear the cookies, but and with the system that I usually do, which is store in memory the access cookie and then just add to the cookies the refresh token. With this method, if you clear the cookies and then you refresh the page, it automatically logs out. So this is why this is very simple and yet very, very effective. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and create the function. And as you can see, this is very, very simple. We basically pass the connection. We don't need to pass any params because again, we're going to use the cookies. And then we simply need to write down this, delete resp cookie, and then pass the name of the cookie, which is basically the refresh unique ID. This is how I usually think about this name. And then we need to put the status of to unroll because basically this was successful, but we did not create anything. And finally, we're going to pass a simple message that says logout successful. And now to complete the application, we need to go inside the router and add the following. First of all, we need to add a new pipeline called auth. And then inside of here, we're going to plug the Guardian pipeline that we just created, which we've named auth pipeline. So basically this is going to go inside this pipeline and go through all of these plugs when we use this inside the pipe through. And next we need to add a new scope with the same, basically we're going to again call just the API, it doesn't matter, and then add the web module, and finally we want to pipe through the first of all the API and then the authentication pipeline. And finally we need to add the basically everything that we created inside of here, the controller, we need to add here and here. So on top here we need to first of all add the new session. So here's exactly why we're going to add it right here, because inside of here, if we add it right here, every time that someone would try to log in, it will give us an error, and we do not want that. We basically want to make sure that the login process is available for all users. And then inside this scope right here, which pipes through not only the API but also the auth, we want to create the following. We'll add again a session and then delete session controller, refresh, and again the same thing for delete. So basically here's exactly what's happening here. Again, here we are creating a session, and then in these two, every time that we call our, for example, localhost 4000 /API /session /refresh, we're going to basically refresh the session. And this is it. In less than an hour, we've already created an entire authentication system inside of Phoenix, and we are very aware of everything that's happening inside of here without having to write a lot of complex code. And this is really the power of Phoenix. You always are in control, yet they give you a lot of things to help you with your productivity. So now let's confirm that everything is working. First of all, you want to start the server. So as you can see, if we make a request to the API /session /new, we're basically going to get back the access token. And then it also adds here to the cookies the refresh token. And then if we come here, we grab this token and then we paste it in here. We're basically going to get back a new access token. And finally, if we come and make a request to session delete with the exact same token, we're going to get a message that says that we logged out successfully. Again, this was an entire video on how to create an authentication system with an API using Phoenix. So if you found this video helpful, just give it a like and share with someone that might also found it helpful.